Welcome to Leading with Empathy and Allyship, where we have deep, real conversations to build empathy for one another and to take action to be more inclusive and to lead the change in our workplaces and communities. I'm Melinda Brianna Epler, founder and CEO of Change Catalyst and author of How to Be an Ally. I'm a diversity, equity, and inclusion speaker, advocate, and advisor. You can learn more about my work and sign up to join us for a live recording at ally.cc. All right, let's dive in. Hello, everyone. I am Melinda Brianna Epler. I'm the founder and CEO of Change Catalyst and author of How to Be an Ally. And today I'm talking with Y-Vonne Hutchinson, CEO and founder at ReadySet and author of How to Talk to Your Boss About Race. In today's episode, we'll be discussing how to talk to your boss about race, the types of conversations we should be having, how we can prepare for them to be successful, and what our ultimate goal is for having these conversations that are sometimes uncomfortable, but extremely important. So hello, Y-Vonne, my friend.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Good. I was thinking back to the time we first met, which I think was like early 2015.
Yeah, it was. So much has changed since then.
No kidding. And I was thinking, I believe you introduced yourself to me as an international labor and human rights lawyer.
Yep.
Yeah. So maybe why don't we start there? Why don't we start with your story? Where did you grow up, and how did you end up doing the work you do now, which is quite different?
Yeah, so I grew up in Texas, still a Texas girl at heart. And I'm actually talking to you from Austin right now, although I'm heading back to California soon. Grew up in Texas, came from a military family. I started my life thinking I was actually going to be an actress. And so I did that work. I was an actress, like a child actress for about 10 years. And there came a point in my career, and I don't talk about this very often, where I was still very young. I had gotten an acting degree from Carnegie Mellon, and I kind of looked at my career and my possibilities, and I just couldn't do it. I was as a Black actress coming out of school in 2003, so dating myself there. The landscape of opportunity is very different than it is now, and look, there's nothing wrong with playing a sassy Black best friend. There are people who have taken that role and broke it wide open and made beautiful things from it, but for me, I sort of looked at that being my career of stereotype, and said I can't do this, especially as a dark-skinned Black woman. Just back then, there were just no opportunities. The opportunities for us to be fully represented were incredibly limited, more limited than they are obviously today. And we still have a long way to go. So I decided to go to law school, because also at the same time, in my young, naive adulthood, I remember I took a class on negotiations, because I'd always kind of been interested in that work. And I remember it was there that we started studying genocide. And it really struck me as a sheltered person from Texas who had, kind of been taught that the world worked in a certain way, and there was a certain amount of justice in the world, and certain things didn't happen anymore. We learned about particularly the Rwandan genocide, and I don't know how much you know about that genocide, but it's incredibly gruesome, and the conduct of the international community during that time was just horrible. It was a horrible failure of international protection, and it was horrifically violent and traumatic for the individuals who were involved within it. And it kind of just opened my eyes to the sort of injustices that, people face every day. And in some ways, I think I was more primed to recognize injustice for others than I was for myself, right? Because I was also, I talk about this in my book, carrying around a lot of the sort of narratives related to my identity, really trying to, perform my way out of racism, be too exceptional to be a victim. And so, for me, in some ways, that work was justice work that didn't provoke me to confront aspects of my own identity, or at least I didn't think would. I learned later that, of course, it would. So went to law school. Long story short is I went to law school, studied international human rights law, and, graduated, and right away I was in the field. So I started working in Afghanistan doing capacity development for the government there. And I went on to work in Burma on the border of Thailand, and also worked at a counterterrorism think tank in Brussels. And then kind of transitioned towards international labor law. And the last assignment I worked with was sugarcane workers who are dying of occupational disease. And, what sort of struck me there was just when I came out of school, I wanted to go to the place where I thought people were experiencing the most harm in order to help people get justice for the harms they experienced. And, I was never the kind of lawyer, probably because I was Black, and I kind of, this was always in the back of my mind that like right away wanted to center myself and be someone's savior. I think subconsciously I knew that wasn't right. But even so, I kind of had this ideas of where violence and oppression took place, and they took place in exceptional circumstances, that were very extreme. Yeah. And, the longer my career went on, and particularly in Nicaragua, what I saw is a sort of the scale and the intensity of everyday violence. And in this particular situation, it was sort of the structural and violence, the labor violence that was, impacting the sugarcane workers there, who were just dying at an extraordinarily high rate of occupational disease. In this case, it was chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology. That's what we called it at the time. I'm sure it's since been renamed, but in essence, people's kidneys were failing mysteriously, who worked in the sugarcane fields, and they were dying at quite an alarming rate. And what I saw then was their children would go into the sugarcane fields. And whereas their parents are getting sick in their 30s and 40s, the kids would get sick in their teens and 20s, and then they would leave behind these babies. So you had this kind of generational violence that was happening and being driven in large part by changes in the way that we work, the global economic demand, labor conditions, all this stuff that wasn't war, right? All this stuff that wasn't exceptional, all the stuff that was sort of thought of as an acceptable cost for in the case of sugar, for us to get our sugar and for us to get our rum, right? Those human lives were worth it. And so it really sort of made me think about the violence that we experience at work all the time, and the workplace as a place of opportunity, but also a place of harm. That was my professional story. At the same time, I was working very toxic organization, and awakening to the role that identity was playing, had started to play, continued to play in my career. I was now in community with other Black people who had very similar stories. I was starting to see that it was like not strange that someone accused me of, plagiarism in my first job. Wasn't weird that people kept commenting on my hair. The lack of mentorship and feedback I received was actually part of a broader pattern. And, and this is happening. And then the racial consciousness that I had became awakened by the violence that we were seeing with Black and Brown Americans. So all this sort of resulted in, me coming back here and deciding, I want to do work for my people in the way that I know how, and at that time I knew labor, right? I knew the workplace. I'd also been an executive. I kind of was just this sort of weird mismatch of puzzle pieces that worked. I knew the future of work, right? I had published on the future of work and done academic research on it. So I just sort of started thinking like, this is the work I want to do. And it like really became apparent to me very quickly that all of these issues, the issues of civil rights, economic empowerment, future of work, like when it came to where we were headed as a country, and this is back in 2015, like it just became so clear to me that the issue of our time, the issue that has continued to be the issue, is the issue of DEI. And in many ways, it feels like a very watered down way to say issues of justice, identity, oppression, marginalization, access to opportunity, impact, the impact of organizations that we're working with. But all of these things, to me, they were future of work issues. That's how I described it at the time. In 2015. And that was like before the election of Trump. That was before the Me Too movement. It was before the Black Lives Matter resurgence in 2020. It was before the sort of radicalization and misinformation campaigns that we see today. And I think all of those sort of tie into questions of identity and voice and power as exercised and amplified through corporate mechanisms. So, that was kind of my path to the DEI space. And I still really try to bring that lens, really fighting against siloing the way we think about DEI, because now I think about it as like we're future-proofing organizations. If the US is going to be majority minority, if we're more diverse than we've ever been before, if we're also more unequal than we've ever been before, if we have these sort of radical terrorist movements driven by white nationalism, if we have an increase in ethnic violence, if we're seeing anti-Semitism on the rise, all of these issues, not to mention issues that affect, I'm just talking about racial issues. We haven't even gotten to the issues that affect parents, remote work. What are we going to do with the increase in disabled workers that we have as a result of long COVID, the mental impacts, mental health trauma that we've all experienced as a result of this pandemic? Like all of these issues are people issues, DEI issues, future of work issues. And so, that's how I'm thinking about it right now.
Oh, there was so much. There was so much in that.
I went off, but
no, it's fantastic. It's fantastic, and it made me think about kind of my own entry into this work, and I also kind of saw it as something that didn't happen here, something that didn't happen right around me, that it happened over in other countries, that it happened in other spaces, and that's where I started my work too. Was the social impact, the international impact, and it wasn't until a little bit later that I realized, oh wait, we really need to do this work here. And it is, I believe, it is all rooted in some of the same issues. I mean, it is a lack of empathy for each other. It is a lack of understanding. It is a lack of doing the work to understand and to really value uniqueness and difference. And
and I think, along those lines, the overlap, I think the greatest trick that, civil rights era politicians pulled, particularly during periods of African colonialism, is differentiating civil rights from human rights. When in reality, those struggles are not that different, right? The struggle for political representation, the struggle to be free from violence, the struggle for economic access. We have disentangled those struggles from global struggles, and that's been intentional, right? Because if it's just in the US, then the solidarity movements don't happen. There's a lot of people who think what made Martin Luther King and Malcolm X dangerous wasn't just their civil rights work, but their solidarity work, whether that be solidarity with labor movements. Martin Luther King was killed while he was, speaking or whatever with the sanitation worker strike, and both Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, towards the end of their lives, have started to align and really start to look at, decolonization in Africa and movements there and stabilizing the region. And we know the role that the U.S. has played in diplomacy, and not to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but I do have a background here, in installing regimes in certain places that are friendly to U.S. interests. And I think that, that teaches us that those struggles are inseparable. And in fact, we are actually much stronger when we can see that common thread, right? And we can unite with people who are facing, common oppressions.
And we can work together to solve them, each of them. So let's move into the workplace. You wrote in your book that nowhere is the issue of race more embedded than in the workplace. In fact, I would argue that it's almost impossible to decouple the two. Can you explain a little bit what you mean?
Yeah. So I think I kind of had my labor history nerd hat on, but I've always been interested in the impact of work and the working condition on our identity. And I think this is what I was trying to get to in the book, and maybe I didn't do it as eloquently as I could have. But when I think about about the stereotypes that are so ingrained in us around ethnicity, a lot of those are actually associated with labor, right? So I talk in my book, and I will never say that the condition of slavery is a labor condition. It's not. It was a social, political, inherited system of, some people call it caste, whatever, generational oppression that went beyond labor. But the stereotypes used to describe Black people and inform common understanding of them were in part necessitated by the condition of slavery, right? So if Black people couldn't feel pain, okay to whip them, right? Okay to work them harder, work them to death. If Black women were inherently loose and hypersexualized, all of a sudden they're not responsible for the mass rape that they suffered, right? So, you look at some of these stereotypes that we still fight against today. If Black people are less intelligent, I still can't wrap my head around the Black people are lazy one, because it's like, wait a second, we were doing all this work and then like, we were lazy. But okay, right, that's the stereotype.
We were doing work for you, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we were doing work for you. But the idea of Black people being lazy, like these are all sort of stereotypes that still, people assume apply to us today. And it's not just Black people, right? If you look at the Chinese in this country, what I found so interesting is particularly stereotypes about Chinese men, right? So when the Chinese came over during the gold rush, originally they were allowed to participate, right? To pan for gold, et cetera. But they were so successful at it, they were so good at it that like the white folks were like, I think not, right? And they banned the Chinese from participating in gold mining, right? From doing that work. And so then they said, well, the work that the Chinese can do is they can run laundromats, they can work in restaurants, right? They can do the feminized labor that we don't have the women out here in the Old West to do. So we're going to have the Chinese to do it. And we're also going to restrict immigration of Chinese women. So these Chinese workers will leave when we're done with them, right? And so that led to the idea that Chinese men weren't really men, that Chinese men were feminine. And, those stereotypes around Asian masculinity persist today, right? Associated with our labor conditions. So in some ways, the work that we've been able to do as people of color has always defined the way that society perceives us. And we've always been restricted from doing the kinds of work that would confer honor, prestige, power, etc. And at the same time, and I'll end here, and this is a very Eurocentric, this is a very US-centric way to look at this. But work, I think even more so because of our kind of Puritan work ethic, is so embedded into our identities. So not only do you say you can't do this work, you say you can't be this person. And I think that is true across racial lines and has been true throughout the history of the United States. So when we think about today and the idea that we would come from this history that is, still very much in place. You look at, for example, like who gets venture capital funding, who gets to be a CEO, who gets to be a founder. These sort of ideas are very much in place. And to say we're going to create a truly equitable workplace here, like that, and it's like, oh, okay. How are you going to undo all that stuff, right? Like that is, I think we're so used to thinking of this work as intrinsic, as emotional, as intuitive, and it's none of those things. It takes strategy, it takes time, it takes dedication and fortitude to undo not just one system, but this web of systems we've created to keep people in their place. That's why I say it's hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you need the expertise, the skills, the science, the storytelling, all of that as well. You can't just say you want to do it and create a strategy around it. You have to know how to accomplish it. Yeah. So when we're talking about conversations around race in the workplace, what are the productive conversations that we should be having that are important to have, with a goal? I think of creating systemic change, creating that culture change, it's a big amount of, it's, as you said, it's a lot of work to do this. It takes time. What are the conversations that get us there?
Yeah. So that's like, this is the whole reason why I wrote the book, right? Because it feels like I just talked about something that feels like super weighty, super heavy, super like impossible to crack. And it's not, right? Like I wrote the book because I wanted to give a resource for individuals to think about culture change, systemic change, right? What is the individual's role in that change?
Right.
I'm going to say right off the bat, every workplace is different. I can't give you, just as like if you were to tell me, Y-Vonne, I need you to run a campaign for me, I can't tell you how that campaign would operate because I would need to know the context. I would need to know the players. I would need to know the objective. But, so I can't say like, here's this particular blueprint for this is what you need to talk about, right? I can tell you what to look for, and I can tell you how to respond to certain situations, and I can tell you what to do if you don't see your objectives. I can't tell you what the objective should be without the context. In my book, when I tell people kind of like, how do you know you have a problem, first of all, like, I think it's important that we start there and we kind of identify what the problem is, right? So first, I just assume based on, we just talked about the history of workplace discrimination in this country. And that was like a 5-minute answer, which means it's like a deep history, right? So just assume if you're like looking at your workplace that like, there's probably some racism afoot, right? I will say that, right? Like it's probably racist. And, that a lot of people don't like me saying that, but facts are facts. And so then the question becomes like it's important to assess like where your problem really lies. And, if you need to be sure, right? So I always say like, take a look around. I think observation and conversation is the sort of best way to get that kind of knowledge. Before you do that though, like please do the self-work. This is a show on allyship. And so I think I particularly recommend this for allies. It is really important that before you even think about like changing your environment, that you understand how you show up in your place within it, right? So before you have a conversation with anybody else, think about your social identities, your race, your gender, your age, your ability, physical disability status. Think about your sexuality, your socioeconomic and class status. Think about all those things and how they impact how you may show up in a room, what you see, but much more importantly, what you don't see, and what struggles you center, right? So like think about that. And if you're coming to this work as an ally, always be mindful that the work is going to be about learning, listening, and decentering yourself. But it's trickier than just that, because there are times when we need allies to take initiative. And I don't think we often enough acknowledge that tightrope between listening and learning and then being ready to do a thing, right? Like how do you know, and I think part of that comes from that work. And then I would say the second thing is you got to be in community when you're doing this. So I always say like this work does not happen alone. There's literally no time, I think, in modern history where I can think that one sole person all by themselves has changed an entire system, right? We work better when we work in community. And I think when we work in community, we also learn what's going on, right? Because like if we're going to have a conversation about racism in the workplace, especially if we're approaching this from a place of allyship, there's just going to be so much you don't see, so much you don't know, right? And there's also work that is probably being done that you want to build off of, right? If you're decentering yourself,
right.
You're not trying to reinvent the wheel, right? You want to add to a movement, contribute to a movement, leverage your privilege in service of movements. It's really important to understand where those movements are happening. And I would say based on those things, based on the learning that you engage in, and most importantly, what you hear other people talking about, the needs they identify, the issues that they raise, and then obviously the issues you see for yourself, I think that's when you decide, okay, what is my strategy? And I'm always going to talk about this work in a strategic way. It's not just about having one conversation. That's the trick of the book. You read the title, you're like, oh, well, I'm going to roll up, I'm going to say the right thing, say it in the right way, and then change.
Magic is all fixed.
Yeah.
It's not change. It's not like that, right? It's like this is a book on like how do you be a better sort of advocate and organizer, right? And it's strategic too. It is at its core strategic. So as you're thinking about who you're in community with and the issues you're seeing, you also need to think about, okay, who is the person I need to talk to address these issues, right? Are you seeing, for example, an instance, a kind of interpersonal instance of racism between your manager and another employee? Are you seeing a dynamic between two people, or are you seeing something larger? Are you seeing just white dude after white dude come through the pipeline and all of a sudden be promoted to leadership, right? Are you seeing inconsistency in what a company portrays publicly with their messaging and then what's happening to the people of color? Are you seeing women of color being asked to do office housework and then other people, getting the shiny opportunities? These are different conversations, right? And they may need to happen with different people. So I also think it's important to think about who you want to reach and whether they're the right person to achieve the objective you want to achieve, which I guess means I missed a step, which is like, you got to be really clear with yourself about what objective you want this conversation to have, right? What change exactly do you want to see? And is this the person that's in a position to effectuate that change? They may not totally own it, particularly in organizational context where we all have, multiple places of influence and often, it takes many people to change a thing. But if there's something you want to see change culturally, structurally, organizationally, think really strategically about who the person is going to be to change that. And then think about who the right person is to talk to that person. I always say sometimes you're not the right person, right? If you take a look in the mirror, and let me start with myself, right? I'm a Black woman, clearly. I run a DEI firm. So that's let's sit in that. And then at ReadySet, we don't, especially in the early days, we just never did advertising, marketing, anything, because I always said, if I have to convince you to be my client, then it's not going to work. Right. So so all of our clients would come to us. And I remember I would sit in rooms, CEO, Black woman, talking about diversity that you are hiring, paying to be there. And I never came cheap, right? So I would sit in these rooms and people would ignore me, talk over me, talk to like my white male subordinate or even my Black male, employee. And it was like, okay, so I'm going to be in my feelings about this, but I also realized I may not be the messenger in this moment, right? So if I'm not the messenger, how to identify who is the better messenger? So I always talk about that. And then I think there are tips for, in general, how you have this conversation. And so I have them in the book, but I say, in addition to doing all that strategic work on the back end, working in coalition, understanding your objective, making sure you're talking to the right person and the right person, and you're the right person to do that talking. There is a way you set up the conversation. You create a space of intentionality. You practice beforehand. You think about what your case is going to be. You think about appealing to their personal interest, because people, especially in the office context, that matters.
Yes. And that's behavior change 101, y'all. Make sure you know what their motivation is for change.
Exactly. Yeah. Like you can, be as idealistic all you want and be like the ethical case for diversity, or even the business case for diversity, which I think is an idealistic case as well. And if the person's incentives aren't aligned with that, like you're saying, like they're not going to do it, right? So you got to think about what their incentives are, what's within their power to do. And, you've got to, I think, be concise and direct and stick to what you know and understand your organization's context, priorities, challenges before you go into the conversation. And I think most importantly, you have to prepare yourself for pushback. And I say this in a way, like it's important that you go in with a growth mindset, a mindset, I always say call people in before you call people out. If you're trying to get somebody allied to your cause, calling them out is going to create more distance and they're not going to want to join you, right? I think calling out serves its purpose. It's an accountability mechanism in spaces where there are no accountability. So I think you hold that, but that's not this space, right?
Right.
If this is the kind of conversation you want to have. So, I think you think about how you call that person in. But if you're having a good faith conversation and you're going in there with your facts and you are really trying to share your own experience, model that growth and connect with someone, and also give them something to do. I always say, give somebody something small and tangible to start out with. You know what I mean? Give them something to do. And, this is a lesson from civil rights movements. Give those parents a pen and a paper and have them write a letter to their senator. You know what I mean? Like, you give people something to do. But, in the case that you do all of those things, there's still a very high likelihood that you're going to get pushed back. And so I also tell people, like, practice for that too. Just because you get pushed back initially doesn't mean you failed. It just means it could take more time, whatever. You should always continually assess the likelihood of success or failure and act accordingly. But, I think it's important to practice that as well. I'll pause there. I
think that is really important, that I would say most of the time, when you have that first conversation, it's not going to go the perfect way that you wanted it to go. It is planting the seed for the next conversation and the next and the next. And that is really important to understand, that it is a continuum and it is a journey.
Yeah, it's a journey and a process, right? Like it doesn't all happen at one time.
So before we go, I have a specific example that I think a lot of people have in their mind when, say, they're picking up your book for the first time or they're coming to this episode. So let me pause for a second before I do that, because I think still within this conversation it's important to talk about power. So let's talk about power for a bit. Why is it important to think about power? What should you be thinking about when it comes to power when you're working to create change and having these conversations?
Yeah, so I write quite a bit about power in my book. I say in my book, look, I could write a whole book about power, but this is not that book. So I
see it coming though.
There are like people who like explored power their entire lives, who are experts. I feel like are much better placed to talk about it than I am, but I have found tools within that discourse that I think are useful. And in my book, I encourage the readers to move away from thinking about power as a binary. So I share the story of, like, there's, in the before times, I would go on panels a lot, right? And I would sit in a panel, and especially because we were so often in conversations about interpersonal bias and individual action. I would always push back and I'd be like, it's the system. Gotta change the system, And there would always be someone who would stand up and they'd be like, look, I get it. It is the system. Like, I'm an individual contributor, or like just started, or like I'm an assistant. Like, I have no power to change the system. So what can I do? And I think that, it always sort of struck me like, that it's, first of all, such a disempowered way to start from. And I think, we've kind of been taught to think this way. Think of power as a binary, like either have it or you don't. It's mysterious. If you don't have it, you're always quite sure how to get it. There's this sort of like taboo about people who care about it too much. And, if you have it, you know how to leverage it flawlessly and you never lose it, right? That's kind of how we conceptualize power, as static and binary. And it's not those things, right? And so I bring in the theory of social power in my book, which is essentially the idea that like when we think about how we use power to influence people, to change behaviors and actions, like what are our sources of power to do that? And the authors of that theory identify 6 sources of power. And I think it's super helpful to think about it this way, because it moves from being like if I have power to a what kind of power do I have? That's a much more empowering way to start the conversation.
That's great. I love it.
Yeah. And so, they talk about, and I'll just go through them really quickly. They talk about, coercive power. So it's the power of a stick. Do you have the power to hold people accountable, like punish people? There's reward power of a carrot. Do you have the power to give somebody something, a bonus, a promotion, some recognition? They talk about referent power, which is in a sense a social power, like we're used to seeing on like social media, or when people are like, you're on the wrong side of history. It's like the popular perception of innate goodness, right? The kind of reverence that other people have for you. There's informational power. Do you know a thing? When we think about the sort of controversy we've seen over NDAs and how, changing the ability of companies to prevent workers from talking about their trauma has opened the floodgates, this sort of knowledge, the informational knowledge and the power within that. And then there's also expert power, which is like, how do you like know a lot about a particular thing, and then people, believe you because you know a lot about that thing. And so not everybody is going to have all of these kinds of power, right? Like not everybody is an expert, has access to all of the information, and then everybody likes them and they can give carrots. Well, very few people, right? If you're Beyonce, maybe you do, but the rest of us don't really have that kind of power. And so it's really important to think about, well, what do I have, right? Do I have like a great social media following? Oh, or if I don't do that, do I have a great reputation at work? Do I have like a really close-knit group of friends? Do people listen to me? Or do I have like access to information? Am I understanding what our competitors are doing, right? Am I understanding, certain strategic priorities that nobody gets, right? Do I have access to information that would impact how my company would see this? Or am I just an expert? Can I walk in and be like, listen, as somebody who's lived in a Black body for 40 years, I want to share my expertise around anti-Black oppression, right? I think everybody has different sources of power, but I recommend as you're engaging in the strategy, because I'm going to say it again, it's all strategic work. It's strategic political work. As you're engaging in the strategic political work, think about these sources of power, because your boss or whoever you're talking to who's in a different organizational position, a different place in the hierarchy as you, they may have a source of power. I also talk about like legitimate power, like the power society confers. They likely have that. But there may be sources of power that you have that they don't. And it's also important to remember that power can be given and it can be taken away, right? Like it can be conferred or it can be taken away. In the organizational context, if you're, an entry-level employee or a different place on the ladder, the hierarchy, it may be hard for you to take away somebody's legitimate power. You can't fire your boss, right? But there may be maybe some people can. I've never been in that position, but there may be some places where you have power that they don't. You may have a better reputation than they do. You may understand this work differently than they do. You may have access to information they want, right? So think about how you can leverage that in your conversation to improve your position, not from a place of domination or control. I want to be very clear, but just from a place of knowing what resources you have at your disposal, right? The goal is not for you to replicate the kind of harms and problematic structures you see in the workplace. The goal is for you to provide something different and to model something better as well.
So say somebody comes to this episode into your book, and hopefully both. The idea is that you listen to this and you read read the book, and we'll have a link to that in our resources, in our follow-up resources. So go to ally.cc and find that. So say somebody comes and they have a boss that doesn't quite get it. They don't get what's going on in terms of their Black experience in the workplace, or their AAPI, their Asian experience in the workplace, and that they may be experiencing microaggressions. They may also be experiencing the environmental microaggressions as well, and their boss is just not addressing it. It's not necessarily an aggressive. They're set against it. They just probably they're not aware. And so how do you have a conversation with your boss about that? And what do you do when your boss kind of pushes back? What do you do in that case?
There's so many times this has happened to me in my life, and I'm a professional person who talks about race now, but in my book, I talk about some of the things that I've lost as a result of this work. I've talked a lot about conversations gone wrong. And I talk about that because there's such a risk in doing this. And I think we marginalized folk carry a disproportionate burden. We Black and brown folks carry a disproportionate burden at work when it comes to having these conversations. I actually advise, if you are on the receiving end of microaggressions, if you're Black and brown at work, I would really caution you to think critically about whether this is something you can safely do. We put ourselves, or are put, both, on the front line so often, and we don't usually get a lot out of it. And I say this, as a person who works on this, but also as a person who wants to hold space for Black and brown trauma and does not want to pressure people into doing that sort of sacrifice. That's not what my book is really about, right? That book is yes, I want to give people tools, and if you choose to use those tools, great. But I'm also speaking about allies. And so what I would say to answer your question, I'm not trying to get out of answering your question. That ties back to think about your identity. Think about if you're the best placed person to have this conversation. If you are seeing a pattern of microaggressions, if you are seeing stuff go down that's impacting you, I would see if like other people are seeing the same thing as well. I would see like where you can leverage your allies. I don't think you have to jump out in the front lines first. I mean, I also think, quite often we're told like you have to handle these interpersonal issues on your own and find there's a place for this. But if you're talking to your boss about racism and their racist behavior as a Black or brown person, you are much more likely to experience backlash and not receive protection when that happens. So I just say, just be really, really mindful if you can do it, right? Now, there may be a circumstance, and I want to honor the circumstance, where you have a boss who wants to learn, who isn't defensive. And then I think you can have this conversation. But, you said in your earlier question, what do you do if your boss gets defensive? I have never in my career, and I've had quite a long one, when white backlash starts, when white retaliation starts, it's very hard. And I say this as a Black person, I don't know other perspectives. It can be very, very hard to get out of that situation. And not a lot of people will have your back. So, in an ideal world, or not an ideal world, but in a better world, best case scenario, if you're undergoing some resistance, your boss will like sort of bristle, think about it, come back and have a conversation with you.
Right.
But, in my experience, it's about 50-50, like sometimes that person has it. I would even say 30-70. Sometimes that person has it, but a lot of time I've seen white denialism, white fragility, white backlash, and retaliation grow over time and get amplified. And if you are not, again, that's why I also talk about acting in community. If you're out here alone by yourself and pointing something out, you're just really vulnerable. So I do, end on this. That being said, I do have tools for how to navigate retaliation and backlash. I think those tools are designed for people who have taken the other steps in the book, who are working in community, right? Who have folks who have that back, who have mapped out those organizational protections and leveraged them. And I think, at the end of the day, and I say this in the book too, I'm all about know when to hold them, know when to fold them, and know when to walk away. If you are Black or brown and you go to your boss and you say, listen, I would really like for you to stop touching my hair, number one. And number two, I would really like for you, I don't know, give me a performance review. Give me some feedback. I would like for you to, maybe I don't want to take notes in meetings anymore. Or I would like for you to acknowledge an idea when I present it in a meeting. Like if you go to your boss and you sort of say that in a much more constructive way than I just said it here, and what you get is silence or pushback, and you start to notice there's a sort of pattern of retaliation. I think it's really also to think about, ultimately, is this the place for you?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Is this really a place where you're going to grow? Is this person going to change? Is this institution going to protect you? Because if not, if there's no room for change, no room for growth, I believe in approaching these conversations for a growth mindset. I don't believe in demonizing any particular group, but I also believe that Black and brown people have been on the front lines of this work for so long, and we have to protect ourselves, right? And so if you feel like you're like, am I in a space where I'm just going to have to sacrifice myself? They're going to keep pulling from me. What am I getting out of this? You're getting something. What am I getting out of this? I think if you find that is a space that fundamentally does not acknowledge your humanity, doesn't care about you, and isn't interested in progress, you don't need to be there. And, I know this is also coming from a place of economic privilege, but and I think, the situation is definitely different if you're a low wage worker, if you're a contract worker, there's a whole different level of precarity there. And I want to hold and acknowledge that. But, I also know that we're working in the middle of the great resignation, or as I heard yesterday, the great renegotiation. And that means that also power has been renegotiated, opportunity has been renegotiated, and you have different leverage than you did a year ago, 2 years ago, definitely 3 years ago. So I think if you, especially now, if you see an opening, if you can get another job and line something up and throw those deuces out and maybe maintain a good relationship with a couple of people, that's what I would recommend doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, power in numbers. I think that is a key piece of there, and also knowing what conversations are going to keep you safe, and what conversations do you need to walk away from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also, for me, it's like, I want to be really clear, because I know I sound very militant right now. I think that every workplace has problems. I don't want to set you up to think you're going to go into a workplace without problems. That's not where I think the decision lies in terms of like, do you stay or do you go? But if you see that a workplace is genuinely not open to your voice and genuinely not resistant to change, not accountable, not doing any kind of work, right? Like there's no progress. And I say in this book, you got to give it some time. I used to say everybody's timetable is different. I kind of recommend like, give it 6 months. If you notice something, you say something, and in 6 months, things haven't changed. Okay. So I things don't change right away, right? I want to acknowledge that, and every workplace has its problems. But if you don't see a genuine commitment to change, if you don't see that your voice is genuinely reflected, and you're doing this work, this personal work, this work in coalition, and it's just not working,
yeah,
maybe it's time to find something else,
Yeah. So this work, even if when it is successful, which it can be very successful in organizations that are open to it and open to change, and really devoting the resources, the time, the money, the people to creating that change, it's still difficult. It's still toxic, and it can still bring up trauma. It can still be traumatizing, and it can still rehash old traumas and all of that. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about self-care in this. What role does that play?
I mean, I think it plays all of the roles. I talk about this in my book. I'm very open about this. I wrote the book during a time of multiple traumas, trauma upon trauma. I signed the book deal when I say I was 8 months pregnant in a book, but I actually did the math today. I think it was closer to 9, because I forgot that in your 9th month, there's still a whole month of pregnancy. But I signed the book deal. I was about 8 months pregnant, about a month before my daughter was born. And I was like bedridden. I was on bed rest because my pelvis was collapsing under the weight of my baby, and I could no longer walk. And so I just remember, I'll never forget that feeling, Melinda, where it's of a Black woman that's worked really long and hard. And I just remember, I just sat in the bed, and I just remember leaning back in the bed and being like, oh my God, I'm in the bed. And I think I got it for like a half a day. And then, everything happened. Everything went down. And I remember physically raising myself out of my bed, such pain. You can't really take a lot of pain medication when you're pregnant. So it's just excruciating pain every day. And I was talking to these people who just, wanted to talk about systemic racism and all the stuff. And, I had this feeling of like, Y-Vonne, this is an extraordinarily painful moment for you, but you got to show up because finally they're listening. Right. And I think that's a moment that a lot of people have. And I think that would be a moment that I would have throughout the writing of this book. So, that was like, pregnant, pelvis separating. Also my dad got stage 4 lymphoma. Shortly after I started writing the book. I gave birth to my daughter, and then we had to move suddenly because like we were in the Bay Area and the wildfires were just so bad, and things were not good. And then my sister died 2 weeks before Christmas when I was writing the book.
Oh.
Yeah, and that was like my personal trauma, and then there's sort of trauma in the world. The January 6th storming of the Capitol and the insurrection, and then the rise in anti-Asian violence, and then a series of like bills and legislation, and it's this environment of incredible instability, and also this personal space with a lot of trauma. And in the book, I talk about writing the book as a process of like opening a wound, mining it for all it's worth, and then like trying to close it and heal it again, and then moving on and opening the next one, right? And that is this work as a Black person, as a person of color, is to we're expected to use our trauma to teach. We're expected to show up when we're hurting. We are also expected to do a lot of this uncompensated, under-recognized, against quite a bit of pushback at our own personal peril, right? Like, putting ourselves at risk. So, in the book, I emphasize quite a bit the need for self-care for Black and Brown folks, because, we can get drained. We can get, drained dry, and there will be nobody to refill our cups, right? And so for me, self-care looked like I take long walks with my dog, and just to clear my head and like enjoy the world that I live in, that I'm blessed to live in, every day. And then I do meditation, just like taking that moment to center. And I do therapy, I should do more therapy. I recognize that, but I do some therapy to like help me also find a place to like unpack this trauma and like get professional help. Racial trauma is real trauma, right? The trauma of racism is so real. It's so extraordinary, and we don't recognize it as that with outside in communities outside of our own. So I think that for me, mental health care. And I also, I advise others, and I have tried as much as I can to invest in social mechanisms, outlets, structures outside of work. So, I also try to spend a lot of time with my friends and family. That daughter that I like, the baby I mentioned earlier is now my daughter, and she lives with me in my house, and I like to spend time with her. I like to pick her up every day from daycare. I like to play with her. I like to watch her learn. And I'm just like, I am mindful that this work is for her, right? I don't think this work gets done in a generation, but I'm not prepared to leave without having made some progress. And the progress that I want to make is for my daughter, and the millions of people like her, my people, and Black and Brown people everywhere. So yeah, I mean, like, that's how I think about my self-care. And I encourage people, particularly people of color, to do this work, to really invest in your own, because nobody else is going to do it. And, know your worth. Don't, if people are asking you to do this work for free, don't, simply.
Yes.
Like that's just another way that value gets extracted from you, and you don't get compensated for your labor. Know your worth, know your limits. Don't be afraid to say no. I said in another interview, and I think in the book, like it can be really tempting to think it's all on us to stop the trauma, but it's not up to the traumatized people to stop the traumatic things from happening, right? Like, there's only so much we can do. And so I think there comes a time when like we've got to take space and say no. And I think not the final thing, but another thing that I talk to Black and brown people about is like decoupling our work from our identity. And I think that's happening within the great resignation, the great renegotiation as a whole. But, I think the truth of it is for us, and I'm talking about, us Black and brown folks, especially, immigrants, people of color, for those of us who have made it, who have gotten into these high opportunity jobs. It's supposed to be the culmination of all of our good choices, our good deeds, our doing things right. There's a saying like Black excellence, right? And that is often reflected in our occupations. We are told that we can achieve our way out of oppression. We're told we can achieve our way out of stereotypes. And, I think in that case, when we at times have sacrificed so much and carved off so many pieces of ourselves and masked ourselves so fully, in service of meeting these goals, when we get there and it's not for us, when we get there and that source of our pride, that source of our achievement is also the source of our trauma, it can be really hard for us to decouple. And like I said, I think it's becoming easier right now, but I encourage people to decouple before there is trauma, honestly, because I think when you kind of decouple when there is trauma, then there's a whole series of I've seen it so many times, like just because I, in community with so many people who've had this experience where, the trauma colors everything else. Right. And, I always, recommend creating those containers before that event or whatever that happens. But in any case, getting that space, getting that distance, and formulating your identity outside of work, like making sure that it's not just about your occupation and what you're doing, but, about who you are as evidenced through your relationships, your talents, your community, all this stuff, I think is really, really important. So I encourage people to do that, to choose their identities and to make sure that those identities go beyond the workplace and to build the supportive structures they need for that kind of reinforcement and support. I think I'm really big on self-care. If I could give every person who's worked in this book a hug, I would. I feel like we do so much, and rarely is it recognized in the way that it should be. And this sacrifice is like happening in the midst of like real pain. And, especially now when we're sort of in these unprecedented moments. So, self-work is vital.
Yeah.
Continue to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. So we're a little bit past time here, and apologies to the interpreters because we got a little over. So just one really quick last question that I ask at the end of every episode, which is that it's really important to me that people who are listening and watching take action as a result of this. So if you could say one action, and I think that particularly for allies, particularly for because you've said so many great things for what actions people should take as Black and brown folks that are doing this work. For allies, what's one action you think you want them to take?
Sorry, I'm trying to speed it up because I just talked about labor and work. I don't want you to continue to work overtime, Lindsay, because I know you're doing such a fantastic job. And thank you. So I think that one important thing there, I think for me, there are so many, but I think for allies, I'm trying to pick one because I want to say show up. I'm just what's happening in my brain is I'm reflecting back on 2020. And I think what we saw in May of 2020, June of 2020 is what happens when white people flood the streets, right? Mm-hmm. The power of the recognition of allies, the demands of allies centering people of color's experiences and demanding more. And how dramatic that is from the status quo, right? Yeah. And that's, I don't think that's because of lack of caring or lack of intention, but it's when you have this collective energy, shit gets done, right? And I think like for me, there's also like that's really hard to maintain. So I say that change is like sustained. It happens incrementally. It happens over time. It happens with consistency. It's like that one action every day, like water. Until you've got the Grand Canyon. The one thing I think allies can do then, if I was going to recommend one thing, I would just say speak up, and not like speak up in the way like diversity is important, but I think like interrupting and agitating collectively is awesome. When you allies do that, and I'm an ally too, I'm an ally to different groups, so I'm particularly thinking about in terms of racial ally. When allies do that, when they're like collectively, like not only do we not like what's going on, we're just going to gum up the works a little bit, make it harder for you to do that thing you're going to do, that things just change. Like, I think that if we did that for like a few days, if like all the white people did that for a couple of days, we would see like some really dramatic changes. So, I would say, not just speak up in terms of I value this and not speak up in small spaces, but I think speaking up publicly at work, in front of your colleagues in a way that risks something, in the streets in a way that risks something, in politicians in a PTA meeting in a way that risks something. I think that's when all of the allies do that. Y'all all have to do the same thing. You don't have to do different things. You can all do the same thing and say the same thing, but you all do the same thing and the game changes. So I would say if I could say one thing for allies to do today, it'd be like, speak up in a way that creates some risk for you and makes it harder for someone else.
Cool. I love it. All right, y'all, do the work. Y-Vonne, thank you. Thank you for this conversation.
It's such a pleasure.
Yeah. Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Thank you, Sarika and Lindsay. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
Hey.
Bye.
Bye.
To learn more about this episode's topic, visit ally.cc. Allyship is a journey. It's a journey of self-exploration, learning, unlearning, healing, and taking consistent action. And the more we take action, the more we grow as leaders and transform our communities. So what action will you take today? Please share your actions and learning with us by emailing podcast@changecatalyst.co or on social media, because we'd love to hear from you. And thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the podcast and the YouTube channel and share this. Let's keep building allies around the world. Leading with Empathy and Allyship is an original show by Change Catalyst, where we build inclusive innovation through training, consulting, and events. Appreciate you listening to our show and taking action as an ally. See you next week.